Hello, I'm Blackman, and welcome to Oversea Ghost. Today's chilling tale hails from Mexico, a curse that leading from the 1980s until 2016. Because the story is told through the eyes of various witnesses, I will be piecing it together for you in segments. We begin now with the first part. Part 1. The Beginning. This happened in Guadalajara, starting during the Christmas season of that distant year 1981. I was 8 years old at the time, and I had had the luck to be born into an economically comfortable family that was, until then, very loving. I wanted for nothing. My parents were both strictly Catholic, so they raised their 3 children the same way. Raul, my older brother, who was 15 then, me in the middle, and Sophia, my little sister, who was just 4. For me, it all began on the Day of the Virgin. Perhaps it had been happening for a while, but it was the first day I noticed, the first day something strange happened to me. I was asleep when strong scratching sounds woke me up, made me open my eyes. At first I saw nothing strange in my room, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, a silhouette took shape beside my bed. Even though panic invaded me in that moment, having been born into such a Catholic family, I think I had the strength to deny the existence of that something in front of me. I stretched in its direction and turned on my bedside lamp. The light only partially dispelled the shadows enveloping that entity of darkness, but I could see it. It was my mother. You'd think seeing her would calm me, but it was the complete opposite. Her mouth moved abnormally fast, as if she were praying, and her gaze, my God, her gaze was filled with an infinite madness that to this day I remember in my worst nightmares. She had her left hand on the wall, to which she'd already ripped the plaster solely with her fingers. "Mom," I called her once, covering myself up to my chin with the blanket. She had her gaze fixed on me. She and that thing was not my mother. It could not be my mother. No more. This time I screamed as tears rolled down my cheeks. Moments later I heard hurried footsteps outside my room and the door opened hastily. It was my dad who, seeing the scene, let out a long sigh and quickly hugged my mother, removing her hand from the wall. As he lowered her arm, a couple of boots fell onto my nightstand. "Don't worry, son. Your mom's just sleepwalking," he told me before taking my mother out of the room. The following days passed with normality. We were a couple of days away from going on Christmas vacation. We were going to Disneyland. I even treasure the photos from this trip because it's our last memory as a happy family. Upon returning, my brother had already been sick with bronchitis or something like that for about a week, so my mother excused him from going to Mass as was our custom. When we returned home, Ruth and Lorenzo, who helped us with garden chores, were very frightened. They didn't let me hear what had really happened, but apparently it had been something with Raul. At that moment, I didn't know what occurred. In fact, I found out 20 years later from my father's mouth. The thing is, upon arriving, the house was a complete disaster. It was even hard to think that a sick 15-year-old boy could have done it alone. What was seen there? They had found Raul eating pigeons and squirrels, obviously raw. The celebration was canceled, and my sister and I were sent to our grandparents' house at that moment, and my parents left with Raul to a private hospital. The grandparents looked very worried, but did their best to make us comfortable. We returned home after January 6th. Apparently, Raul had recovered completely, and save for the absence of Ruth and Lorenzo, who resigned a few days after the incident, everything seemed to be returning to normal. They said my brother was normal now. However, I noticed a radical change in his way of being, in his behavior. He had become violent with erratic attitudes that became more pronounced as the day went on until nightfall. It wasn't even rare in those days for him to hit me and my sister, when until then he'd never laid a finger on us. And the same happened at school. In fact, it didn't take long for him to be expelled, just a few weeks later. This I also found out years later. The reason he was expelled was that during a fight with a classmate, my brother bit his arm and tore off a piece of it. During that year, there were too many incidents involving my brother. Each time something happened, he seemed to be worse, and no matter how many doctors my parents took him to, he didn't seem to improve. They even took him to Mexico City, at that time the federal district, with a multitude of neurologists and psychiatrists, and they performed all possible studies on him. My family's life was economically disrupted, and that's with my dad's brothers taking care of the business. On quiet days, my brother talked about specters of women that appeared to him in the house, though certainly for me, what terrified me was him, and even his physical appearance began to deteriorate. Thus passed 6 long years, and then came a streak of remission, a streak in which my brother had 6 months without erratic or violent behavior. A neurologist from the Mayo Clinic, as a group of hospitals all over the U.S. where the best specialists money can access is called, had given him a medication, and everything seemed to be calm. It was Christmas season of 1987. Our family was preparing to give a dinner no one could forget. And well, that would be achieved, though not for the reasons we had planned. Many family friends attended the scene, besides my uncles, my cousins, and this was very strange since Raul had fallen ill, visits had been strictly prohibited. I remember very well that by that day I was already fed up with my brother. Finally, at 14 years of age, I felt I was already an adult, and not only that, I felt a hatred for my parents for the negligent treatment I received thanks to Raul, the crazy one who got all the attention. I made the decision not to pay him any attention all evening, even though Sophia, my 10-year-old sister, had been warning me since morning, Raul is not well. And I responded with something I regret to this day. That crazy guy can go to hell. I could only see how her eyes filled with tears, and I felt like trash afterwards. Even now, just remembering it, I feel that way. The Christmas Eve dinner proceeded calmly. People laughed, conversed. Good wishes simply did not stop flowing. I tried to avoid my sister's gaze, and not even the idea that my parents had finally bought me the Nintendo I'd asked them so much excited me anymore. A frightening scream followed by a horrible crash coming from the living room made everyone shudder. When we ran to it, we saw an equally horrible panorama. Louis, one of the older cousins, had been thrown from the first floor and lay badly injured on the marble table in the center of the living room. He had fallen from a height of approximately 7 meters, but he was at least 5 meters from where he would have been thrown. It was impossible. Louis was a normal boy. He weighed about 95 kilograms, and the only one who was on that first floor was Raul. And the party was over. Obviously, emergency services were called, and Louis was taken to the hospital. He survived, though it took him years to walk without a walker. Later, he himself confirmed that indeed the one who had thrown him was Raul. That night, I think no one in the house could sleep. At least I couldn't. I heard footsteps all over the house, even on the exterior walls. Occasionally, I heard attempts to turn the doorknob of my door. In those moments, I could only curl up in the corner of my bed. For years, Raul's windows had safety glass, and his door was locked from the outside. And even though my father had sworn to me that he had put Raul to sleep and secured his room, I felt that he had found a way to escape, as if he were some kind of demon. And by then, I didn't see him as my brother, but a monster. Little by little, the constant state of alert from that night overcame me until I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night only to realize with terror that my door was open, and all over the room I heard stifled giggles. Scared to death, I got up to close the door when I heard, "Little brother." "Oh." That was followed by a laugh, and perhaps I imagined what followed out of fear, but I saw my brother come out from under the bed, crawling as if he were a cockroach towards me. Without thinking, I ran towards my parents' room. The sudden appearances of my brother even made my parents bring exorcists to the house, have cleansing rituals done, and so on. Without any of this working, My brother's moments of lucidity became increasingly scarce, and his alter ego was increasingly violent. It was in October of '88 when the family made the decision to commit my brother to a mental sanatorium permanently. I remember I was coming home from school and could see my brother sitting in the patio. He seemed calm and conscious, which is why I think I felt the imperative need to apologize for all the things I'd said about him. Raul would only be with us for the rest of the week, and then he'd be transferred to a mental sanatorium in Spain. I sat next to him. Before I could start talking, he said, "Little brother, I'm sorry I wasn't a better brother to you." That made tears well up in my eyes, and I realized how unfair I'd been with him. He continued, Everything is Mom's fault. Since she came to my room at night, she was watching me, and from that day, I felt I was no longer the same person." What he said hit me like a brick wall because that was exactly what had happened to me. The blood demons are consuming me. She tolerates them in some way, but I am weak, that's why I do it. Her blood will consume us. Her blood will consume us, he said again, each time faster and more agitated. "Little brother, I want you to forgive me for everything, and for this." Shortly after, my brother slit his own throat with a piece of rusty metal. That was the beginning of my experience. The house fell into chaos in a couple of minutes after my brother's death. In less than an hour, all my uncles and my dad were surrounding the corpse. They kept repeating phrases of disbelief. Attention and pain were palpable in everyone. They were on edge. However, and you can call me crazy, but even with the shock I'd suffered, I could see behind those sad faces a kind of almost morbid relief in all of them. My aunts and my mother were inside the house praying, and for a few hours my sister and I became almost invisible to the point that they forgot I was there, just a few meters from my brother's body. One of my uncles, who was a specialist doctor, begged my father to let him perform the legally required autopsy on Raul, since finally it was never known exactly what illness he suffered from, and by law in Mexico, in all cases of suicide, a necropsy must be performed. However, the equivalent of about 50,000 current pesos was enough for the people from the public ministry to turn a blind eye. The funeral was strange. I remember it was raining terribly all over Guadalajara, and only my family attended. My mother seemed to have decided to cry and scream all she hadn't done when my brother killed himself. She screamed, sometimes scratched her face, then threw herself onto the muddy ground and writhed. Perhaps you'll judge me for what I'm going to say, but it was a grotesque spectacle. I remember my sister didn't even want to get close. As they were lowering the coffin, I remember clearly how my mother punched the priest right in the face and then ripped off the rosary she was wearing around her neck along with her blouse and threw herself into the grave, the last thing I could see before they took me out of there. That night, we slept at my grandparents' house while my mother was hospitalized, apparently due to a nervous breakdown. We were sitting at the table having dinner. Grandpa was reading a Reader's Digest magazine, and Grandma seemed annoyed. Stupidly, it occurred to me to ask, "Grandma, what is a blood demon?" She fixed her gaze at me and quickly stood up towards me, grabbed my arms and asked, "Did you hear that?" Fearfully, I confessed it was one of the last things my brother had told me, and I also confessed what they'd told me about my mom. In a fury, she began to shout, "I knew that witch was going to poison the family." And before she could continue, I saw Grandpa stand up and slap her. The topic was never touched again. Part 2. Mazamitla. For a time, we considered the matter closed. My father sold that house and we moved closer to his brothers and the grandparents, and even my mother seemed to be handling the grief as best as possible. In November of 1989, the whole family organized a family trip to the ranch they have in Mazamitla. In a cold, rainy November of '89, my family considered that the entire family needed a break, especially after the events occurred with Raul and my mother's erratic behavior. We didn't know that little more than a month later we would be burying her. The family trip began, like all big families' trips, with a caravan on the highway, and both my father and my uncles looked more enthusiastic than my sister and I and my cousins, certainly. The trip was slow and tiring, especially due to an annoying drizzle that slowed our progress. On the way, one of my aunts had a tire blowout and almost went off the road. However, in the end, she was able to control the vehicle and the incident was solved with a scare. I still remember the great caravan stopped on the shoulder of the highway while Grandma constantly said that the whole trip was a terrible idea and even offered to pay for vacations for all of us wherever they wanted, but she didn't want us to go to Mazamitla. That reaction seemed disproportionate. I remember standing at the edge of the highway while Grandma argued with her sons when my cousin Louis, who still couldn't walk without a walker, told me, "Grandma, every year that passes seems crazier to me. Every time we come to Mazamitla, she gets like this, though I think it's the first time you get to see her." "And why do you think that is?" I asked. "She doesn't get along with my dad. Besides, they always argue because Uncle doesn't allow anything remotely religious in the house." "Uncle Joaquin is a good person," I replied. "I hope so," he said at that moment. He made a long pause and finally decided not to share what he'd kept to himself. "Forget it. If Uncle is a good person, he's just had a difficult life." The trip resumed without further setbacks until we arrived in Mazamitla. Upon arriving at the hacienda, Uncle Joaquin, Uncle Felix, and his 3 children were waiting to welcome the family. The hacienda, despite having all the comforts of a city house, always appeared to be a gloomy, cold place. When this hacienda was bought, everyone thought the grandparents would tear down the old building and build something new. But I suppose Grandpa thought that was a bad investment, so he decided to remodel it. And in fact, the property to this day has that architecture of the large houses from the early 20th century. By the way, as far as the family knows, or at least as far as the cousins know, that place had no dark past or anything of the sort. When this welcome scene was going on was at least when I noticed something was wrong. There was something strange in the atmosphere. My Uncle Joaquin stood up to make a toast to the family and its prosperity. Obviously, he did so with many swear words, as he was the most foul-mouthed of the brothers, but he also gave a message for all the cousins. "Look, kids, I don't want to see you playing at the edge of the hacienda that borders the forest. I already told Arturo and Fernando, the foreman, to bring you immediately here if they see you there, and even if your parents get angry, I'm going to give you a spanking." I suppose because we were children, the adults didn't tell us the reason. However, it was my cousin Joaquin who said that bears had been seen roaming around those places. That night, I remember I got up to get water. Honestly, I don't remember the time. But I could see Uncle talking with his foreman and several men who were carrying weapons and lamps. Without giving it much importance, I went back to my room. When I was passing through the living room to go up to the bedroom they had given us, I clearly heard someone knocking on the window glass, as if hitting it with a finger. At the moment, I was startled, but given that my uncle was in the central patio, I supposed it was one of his men coming to report something. The living room window, besides being large, had a type of semi-translucent curtain which was closed, and on the other side one could make out a silhouette. Just that. The figure knocked on the glass again with a bit more urgency. "Who is it?" I said, progressively more nervous. The only response I received was a new knock on the window. I said, "Who is it?" It responded with an extremely deep voice while knocking on the glass with more force. "Open the door," it said, while the window seemed about to break from such blows, and for my part, I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't understand what was happening. Then I felt a pull backwards that made me fall to the floor. "God damn it, son of a bitch," my uncle shouted as he opened the main door, and he and his men rushed out. It didn't take long for several gunshots to be heard in the distance. It was my Aunt Felix who found me in the living room, and she looked nervous. Her eyes were tearful. She explained to me that they had had problems with thieves in recent weeks, and as the police took a long time to arrive, my uncle had made the decision to protect the hacienda until the police arrived. My cousin clarified to me later that in mid-October of that year, while checking with my uncle and Arturo the part of the hacienda that bordered the forest, they saw what seemed to be a naked man, extremely skinny and bald, who moved strangely, as if he were dancing among the trees. He seemed to be smiling even though he was far away. My cousin said that immediately Uncle told Arturo to take my cousin to the hacienda, and he went with Fernando to look for this thing. He says that after this they observed things in the hacienda, both he and his younger sisters especially. After the incident of the past night, my uncle, I suppose, had to talk to all the adults about what was happening, but everyone continued with the family trip as if nothing had happened. However, on all the outings, I noticed that both my uncle and his men carried weapons, because of the bears, I supposed. The next incident would be on the fourth day when we were returning from Mazamitla, where we had gone to have breakfast. Upon returning to the hacienda, one aunt was having a nervous breakdown, saying that a naked man came out on the road and stood in front of her truck, and that he carried a knife and was approaching her. She only stepped on the gas and ran him over, and indeed her truck had the windshield partially smashed. She says she didn't see him fall, and another detail she emphasized a lot was that the damn man had no eyes. That same afternoon, both my aunt and her family left for a hotel in Mazamitla, saying they would meet up with us when we went to the cabins in the mountains. My cousins confirmed their mom's story to me, and even my cousin said the man had no eyes, and that he smiled as he approached with open arms. But there was a different detail in her story. To her, what he carried in his hand didn't seem like a knife. She said he carried a bone. That was a very tense afternoon at the hacienda, but everyone stayed. They had come to the conclusion that they couldn't abandon their brother. Even Grandpa spoke up and hired a private security company to secure the hacienda so that Uncle Joaquin and his family could forget a bit about their worries in the mountains. I remember the amount of security Grandpa hired was so large that he took the luxury of inviting his two foremen and their families to the mountains. And on the last night, one of the cousins woke up everyone in the hacienda with his screams, because according to him, a naked man came out from under his bed, crawling like an insect. He didn't tell me the first time. It inevitably came to my mind. Raul. That night, both my sister and I, upon waking up from the scream, saw how someone jumped from one of the windows on the second floor. Uncle Joaquin refused to go on the family outing, but finally Grandpa convinced him to do it. My cousin Joaquin confirmed to me that the old man told him that if he took his family out of there, the men he had hired could use more extreme measures. So I suppose Grandpa paid for that security so they would kill that intruder. The day to leave for the cabins arrived. It was one of those very cold days and cloudy ones at the end of November. All the cousins got into Uncle Joaquin's truck, and they gave us a huge blanket to cover us, because as we went into the forests, the cold would increase. Again, we left in a caravan, and as we passed, my aunt, who had seen the man without eyes, joined us. In general, the day was going well. All the cousins were joking around in the back of the truck, leaving behind the memory of those apparitions at the hacienda. Everyone was having fun, except my cousin Joaquin, who was quiet, pensive, and whose face reflected fear. When we got onto the forest road towards the cabins, "Have you seen Joaquin?" my sister asked. "Joaquin, is something wrong?" I asked him as I approached him. "What's going to happen first?" he responded, smiling nervously, then looked back towards the trees, towards those trees that bordered the road where Uncle's truck was going at a good speed. I remember I went back to sit next to my sister, and she covered her face, terrified. "What's wrong, Sophia?" I asked, puzzled by that situation, given that around us the cousins continued talking happily and laughing. "In some trees," she said, without uncovering herself, "there are figures." Thrown off, I looked towards where I thought Joaquin was looking. At first, I swear I didn't see anything. However, out of nowhere, like an anthropomorphic shadow sitting on the branches, and as the truck continued on its way, it seemed to disappear and reappear, as if it were moving at the same speed as the truck among the trees. Seeing that, I rubbed my eyes to see if it wasn't tiredness or something like that, but the shadow was still there. Then the truck braked violently, raising a great cloud of dust, and a dry thud was heard. Suddenly, there was a naked person right in the middle of the truck bed. Even though that person didn't fall on anyone, the screams were not long in coming, and that had a just reason, because the image was horrible. The person who fell among us had tufts of hair, and his head looked deformed. He was completely covered in blood, and besides, his limbs were twisted. You could see his broken bones in different places. I remember very well that my uncle got out of the driver's cab and looked pale and sweaty. "Kids, get down quickly," he said while covering the body with a blanket. My uncle's desperation was obvious and understandable. He had run over and probably killed a person. We could already see the other uncle's truck approaching when suddenly 2 of my cousins let out a horrible shriek. The person who lay on the blanket, not breathing a moment before, began to writhe in a horrible way. I even remember seeing one of his arms as if it were a bloody ratchet. Seeing this and forgetting about us, my uncle jumped onto the edge of the truck and said, don't move your arm. Help is on the way." At that, the blood-covered person let out a kind of gultured, frightful laugh and in one jump stood up. And I still remember that unpleasant sound the broken bones made as they clashed against each other. And without stopping laughing, he jumped from the truck bed and disappeared among the trees on the other side of the road, while my uncle ran after that thing, saying he could help him. I was so nauseated by that image of how that thing's arms moved in such an unnatural way while running that I vomited, and several of my cousins did the same. When the rest of my uncles and my dad caught up to us, they went to discuss things away from us. However, it seemed logical to me that the trip would end there after this horrible and unusual incident. But in the end, the only thing that was done was to throw away the blood-stained blanket that now smelled of putrefaction, clean the blood off the hood and windshield of my uncle's truck, and the rest of the way, we all went silent. And I swear I began to see this figure among the tree branches again. Upon arriving at the cabins, the staff there told us to be careful because they had seen a large animal in the vicinity. The trucks were parked and all the families occupied the cabin assigned to them. That day we simply all went to sleep. Apparently that accident had left everyone exhausted. At least it had me. However, at night, a strange sound woke me. It took me a while to identify it, but without a doubt, it was the sound that the bones of the person Uncle had run over made when he stood up. And that sound was heard coming and going outside the cabin, as if that thing were running from one side to the other. And then the sound stopped outside my bedroom window, and I began to hear a guttural giggle that seemed to come from under my bed when I heard that voice was Raoul's. This made me get up immediately, and when I saw it, a figure leaning against the metal protectors of the window. I must admit, I'm not sure if it was the same person Uncle had run over, but I screamed and ran out to my parents' room. In a few minutes, all my uncles and the cabin staff were outside the house, and I hadn't hallucinated at all because they found fresh footprints around. After they combed the area for a while, they finally said it had only been a bear. However, so that the family would be calm, the two hacienda foremen who were there with their families, as I told you, said they would do rounds with their rifles. My father closed the curtains of my room and moved the bed so it wasn't next to the window. When I lay down, my sister came in and asked permission to stay with me, and after the scare I had, I gladly accepted. She got between the sheets and lay down next to me. Brother, what was outside was the witch that Uncle ran over. I saw her. I had gone to the bathroom, and when I returned, I saw her pass by my window. And upon seeing her, I was petrified at the entrance to the bedroom and didn't want to approach the bed anymore. Forget that. It was a bear, Sophia, I responded, trying to convince myself of that tale too. You know well it wasn't. Even though that thing had no jaw, I don't know how it spoke. It said, "Open the door." The rest of the night, I had a restless sleep plagued with nightmares, and I remember I dreamed something related to Raoul, but I don't remember exactly what. Part 3. The Grandparents' House. Upon returning from that trip, the whole family felt drained, and given that December was approaching again, there was even fear on my father's face. I would be lying if I said everything started again on a day of the Virgin. I certainly don't remember exactly what day it was, but yes, that night I went down for some water and found my mother standing in front of a wall in the living room, as if murmuring something. Upon seeing her, I was paralyzed, and in my mind came that memory of when I found her at the foot of my bed years before. As soon as I saw her, I didn't think twice. I ran towards the room, and I can almost swear she was stepping on my heels. I even remember looking back, and she seemed to be chasing me but walking backwards. I locked myself in and cried between my sheets as the door shook. Besides being scared, I was fed up. The first thing I would do in the morning would be to confront my mother. I couldn't take this situation as it was. And indeed, that morning I remember going down very upset, and at the kitchen table were my sister and my dad. I told him everything that had happened with Mom that night, and he gave me a rather strange look. "You're going crazy too? Your mother couldn't sleep. She had a panic attack, so I had to take her to the emergency room, and we returned around 5 in the morning." My dad's words left me frozen. However, my sister also said something at that moment. "Something bad is happening, Dad, because I also sometimes see Mom walking on the grass at night." "Look, kids, what happened with Raul has been especially hard for your mom. I know she has problems, but you shouldn't be afraid of her." However, despite my father's words, things in the house were getting worse day by day. Occasionally, I saw my mom talking to herself or even lighting candles to an idol made of straw that I never knew where it came from. December 22nd was when everything definitively went to hell. I remember being asleep when I heard my sister let out a desperate scream. Without thinking, I took a bat and, gathering courage, ran to her room. There was my mother, naked, holding Sophia by the wrists. Instinctively, I gave her a blow so she would let go of her. I took her, and together we ran to our grandparents' house. We couldn't take it anymore, and you can imagine it was a scandal. My grandmother, without hesitation, filed a complaint against my mother, and even though my dad threatened to take us by force, the rest of the brothers agreed that until this situation was clarified, it would be better for us to stay with the grandparents. My dad had no choice but to reluctantly accept, especially since Sophia didn't want to ever return to that house. That whole affair had marked her. Let me get ahead and tell you that, unfortunately, that nightmare version of my mother was the last I saw. She died on the 28th of that month. Her funeral was with a sealed coffin, and none of her family attended. Many doubts remained with me, but my father took the secret to the grave. Despite confessing me many things, this was an aspect he never spoke about. When he got out of the hospital, my dad was no longer the same. He always looked fearful. In fact, we went to live with the grandparents, and he became increasingly religious. At some point, I hoped that from that, everything would improve. But in Grandma's house, things went from bad to worse. When my mother died, it seemed my entire paternal family could finally breathe easy. Perhaps we, her children, too. For some reason, we all had this preconceived idea in our heads that my mother was the source of what had corrupted Raul and had brought disgrace to the family with Louis' unfortunate accident. However, for some reason, my dad, since my mother's death, seemed more restless, terrified even. So much so that my grandparents sent him for more than a year to the mental sanatorium in Spain where Raul was supposed to go. That was a long time ago, and here I ask for your forgiveness because the memories from when I lived in my grandparents' house begin to become somewhat nebulous and confused. It should also be clarified that at that time they took us to a psychiatrist who was a very good friend of the family, who prescribed us some pills, the only thing I remember of which was that they made me feel permanently confused. Since my dad was absent, they made the decision to take us out of school temporarily under the pretext that we were emotionally unstable. And perhaps that was true. We went to church daily and prayed a bit at home. I think that became a large part of our activities in those months. I resumed ninth grade until September 1990 in a Catholic secondary school, and Grandma did not allow Sophia or me to have visitors or attend any kind of gathering. That kind and grandmotherly woman we had known had hardened her heart towards us. A memory. My sister once told me, "What happens is that we carry Mom's blood." And whether this is true or not, we could never prove it, although later we realized that our grandparents kept many secrets that, with good reason, they did not want known. Grandma's house was very large, and there were entire sections where we were strictly forbidden to enter. I think it was around October of that year when strange things began to happen in Grandma's house. We were celebrating something. I really don't remember what it was, but it was night. The adults were partying in the living room, and the cousins along with us in an adjacent room. Then a scream broke the festive atmosphere. It was Grandma's, and it came from the kitchen. Obviously, everyone hurried to see what had happened and found my grandfather pale and my grandmother lying on the floor in his lap. Grandpa only said they had seen a thief in the patio. My uncles ran to check, but there was no sign that anyone had entered. Also, years later, after both had died, my father confessed to me that in a letter Grandma wrote to him at the sanatorium, she told him they had seen my mother walking around her patio, naked, smiling, and moving in an unnatural way, as if she were mocking them. After this incident, Grandma became even stricter with us. More hours of prayer, no outings. Something strange was happening in that house, but it wasn't until the end of October that I could confirm it. It was a rainy day. I went downstairs. I had slept a large part of the afternoon and still felt somewhat drowsy. Upon reaching the living room, I noticed that, with his back to me, was what appeared to be Grandpa, naked, though his movements were strange. Without a word, he turned and ran towards me. I don't remember having seen his face. I don't even remember what he looked like. I lost consciousness, and it was precisely Grandpa and my sister who found me in the living room, having wet myself, the next morning. Days later, when I dared to tell her what had happened, my sister whispered in my ear very slowly, "I have seen him too, but don't go believing that is Grandpa. And only if you happen to see the smiling woman, leave the house immediately and wait for someone to arrive. That's what I do." When my sister told me this, I remembered that indeed on several occasions when we arrived, we had found her alone on the porch. I remember that for some reason I got quite angry with her. "You too, Sophia? You also believe in all that ghost and devil nonsense? That doesn't exist. Only God exists." She looked at me very seriously and simply responded, "Brother, I only believe in what I see, and if I tell you this, it's because I love you, but you know well what you do." She gave me a kiss on the forehead and went to her room. And at this point, I felt I was going insane, the truth, and I walked carefully through the house, tried not to stay alone, and it was my turn to see, on 2 more occasions, the Black Grandpa. That's what we started to call him. In December, at one of our cousins' birthday parties, I remember well that after the party, one of my older cousins, Raphael, asked us, "And have you guys seen the ghosts in Grandma's house yet?" "You mean the Black Grandpa?" I answered by reaction, and the older cousins started laughing and making comments that the grandpa really appeared, and then they told a story about why they believed the place was haunted and about what was hidden in the forbidden rooms. Despite what we talked about and that we made fun of the Black Grandpa, the truth is we were all terrified of the idea of running into him. I think one of the biggest problems of being a child is that no one takes you seriously or gives you explanations, and above all, no one believes you when you talk about this kind of thing. I remember the spankings Grandma gave us the first time we tried to talk about this apparition in the house. But everything would change later, a few months later, when we arrived from doing some shopping with Grandma. It was around 7 at night. We opened the door to the living room, and there was the Black Grandpa waiting for us. It was very dark, but we knew it was him. "Honey, is something wrong?" Grandma said, trying to take a step forward, and immediately my sister grabbed her arm and said firmly, "That is not Grandpa." That thing that was in the living room let out a laugh so brazen I didn't know if it was a lament, and my grandmother fainted, and we focused on dragging her out of the house. By the time Grandpa arrived, Grandma had regained consciousness. The following days, we went with one of my uncles to spend Christmas and New Year's. Obviously, the celebrations would not be at Grandma's house, but Sophia told me something very strange. She said that on one occasion when she passed by the grandparents' house in the car with my aunt, she could see some figures in white robes inside the house. What I can say with certainty is that my uncle's house had a completely different atmosphere. It was tranquil and didn't have as many religious idols hanging. The grandparents, for obvious reasons, didn't feel comfortable. They said they were imposing and that they couldn't wait to return to their house. But every time they were questioned as to why they were waiting, they only said that the works were not yet finished. It was already mid-January 1991. The works still had not finished, but a problem had arisen with some farmland, and the titles of ownership were needed, which were in Grandpa's study. The study was one of the forbidden zones of the house. Initially, we all thought Grandpa would say he would go get them, but he was adamant in saying he could not enter. He gave a very old set of keys to my uncle and told him where to find said titles. He warned him about not snooping around in his things, and my uncle responded, "I know you and Mom are witches." That, which evidently was a joke, did not sit well with Grandpa at all, who quickly responded, "Well, it's because of these witches that you have everything you have." Upon entering the house, my uncle apologized to me for making me go with him. "This house has always terrified me. In fact, everyone," he told me, but I responded that there was no problem. The wing of the house to which only the grandparents had access was much stranger. First, the hallways that connected with the main house or the permitted zone had been blocked with a wall. There was no way to access this place from inside the house. The only way was a heavy iron door that was covered with a tarp outside. The door itself was very strange, or at least that's how I remember it, even though I can't describe it. Upon entering, this zone was a hallway with doors on its left side. Inside, one could vaguely see that all the windows had been bricked off, and Grandpa's study was the room at the end. This study was actually very normal. There was a bookcase, a giant desk, and an old shotgun. He found the papers and we hurried out. At that moment, before leaving, I don't know what he saw, but he grabbed my arm, and without closing that place, he shouted at me that we should get out of the house quickly. In mid-March, we finally returned to Grandma's house, although frankly, I didn't want to. But business was business, and they didn't even contemplate the idea of leaving them alone. My uncle had offered for us to stay with him, and then he told me that time we went to the study, he saw that smiling woman with white hair there in the hallway. Sophia called them the Black Grandpa and the White Grandmother. That no longer made me laugh at all. The house became plagued with strange sounds. It wasn't rare to hear doors opening or the bathroom keys being turned. And the best thing, the only thing you could do, was to ignore them. Sometimes you could even hear a person praying inside the rooms. The grandparents acted as if nothing was happening and simply ignored us when we came to question them. We were in a state of frightful paranoia for some time, but when my father returned from the sanatorium, things at Grandma's house took a turn for the worse. Both my sister and I thought that with my father's return, we would recover a bit of that family life we'd lost some time before. But unfortunately, nothing was further from reality. I remember well when we went to pick him up at the airport. It was a rather rainy day. Even my uncle and my grandfather thought his flight wouldn't leave from the federal district. However, to everyone's surprise, my dad arrived on time. The first image I have of my father was that of a gaunt man with deep black circles under his eyes, sparse hair, and several kilos underweight. My dad hugged my sister and me at the same time, but for some reason, it felt like something was missing. On the way back home in the car, I remember Grandpa and my uncle talking to my father, and he only gave them laconic answers lacking any emotional equivalent, which one would expect after being away from his family for so long. My sister asked me in a very low voice, "Did they steal Dad's soul?" And I immediately responded, "Of course not, don't be silly." However, that's exactly what I was thinking. A dinner was made to celebrate that my father had returned, although this was not at the grandparents' house. I think most of my uncles were terrified of that house, but whether out of faith or respect for the grandparents, they didn't say absolutely anything. At the end of this evening, the uncle we had stayed with offered my father that both he and we stay with him. He told him he even had the guest rooms ready to host us for as long as we wanted. I even think I heard my uncle say the word indefinitely. And when my father responded, "Don't worry, we will return to the grandparents' house. Finally, they are already old, and one never knows." When he said that, my uncle's face twisted into a grimace of horrible unease, and he took my father to his study to talk seriously. This would be another of the things I would find out years later, because that night, my uncle told him what he and I had experienced in the grandparents' house, and that he didn't think it fair to expose his children that way. My uncle came out of his study, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, "Son, I really tried, but your dad doesn't listen to reason." The first night my father slept in the grandparents' house, you could feel an unnatural silence. Scared to death, I remember being wrapped in my sheets, facing the wall. I don't know from what time it began, but in the hallway where all the guest rooms were, where my sister, my father, and I were, footsteps were heard. And by the little light that filtered under the door, you could see a shadow making its trips from one side to the other. At first, I thought it was perhaps my father, but after an hour of hearing them and seeing how they passed, I knew something was wrong, and I fell into a restless sleep, then woke up with the sound of someone trying to force the latch of my door. Luckily, both my sister and I installed door stops on our doors to feel a little safer. I remember taking refuge under the bed and waiting until dawn to be able to go out. At breakfast, it was noticeable that my sister had had a night as horrible as mine, and my father seemed distraught, though he didn't tell us why. Later, I found out that that night he slept with the door open and watched as the black grandpa walked down the hallway naked, and from time to time stopped to offer him a smile, a crooked smile. At that point, I must confess that not even the grandparents gave me confidence anymore, and not because they had tried to do anything to me or my sister, but because it was evident that that house hid secrets. Thus passed a couple of months in which I fell asleep with headphones to be able to bear the sounds of the house, the footsteps, the knocks on doors and walls and windows. It was August or September when I returned from school, and as there were several patrol cars and a Red Cross ambulance parked outside the house, I ran inside without hesitation. Upon entering, I realized that a good part of my uncles were already there, arguing heatedly with the officers. "How is it possible you haven't found anyone in the house?" they asked. "I don't know what you want me to tell you, sir. 10 guys searched the house from top to bottom and didn't find any signs that anyone had even entered here. But my brother told me that person didn't run towards the exit, but towards the bedrooms. There has to be someone. Look, sir, we are going to search the house again, and you can accompany us to verify there is no one." My father was dejected, sitting on some of the living room chairs with a lost gaze. I went and sat next to him, and I don't know if because of his state he didn't realize it was me who sat at his side, but he began to talk. Dad and I were reviewing some papers here in the living room when from the back something came running towards us. It was a gaunt, almost cadaverous figure, and its steps made no noise. I tried to warn my dad, but he simply didn't pay it any attention, and suddenly, just as I had seen it, that horrifying vision disappeared in the blink of an eye, and then it appeared again, biting your grandfather on the forearm. And then, as if it were an animal, it ran on all fours towards the back of the house. Upon hearing that, I was so terrified I had to get out of there. In the ambulance, the paramedics were putting compresses and bandages on Grandpa, and I intentionally asked him, "So, what happened?" He gritted his teeth and finally said, "It was a drug addict who broke into the house. Guadalajara is getting worse every day, and that son of a bitch Casio doesn't do absolutely anything." He was referring to the then governor. And at that moment, my sister approached me and said, "The white grandma attacked Grandpa." The paramedics suggested to the family that those wounds needed to be seen by specialist doctors. Besides, I don't know how to explain it, but Grandpa didn't look well. He was pale and could barely stand. That day, Grandpa was admitted to a private hospital. In fact, as I recall, he was admitted to intensive care. My uncle finally took us and my dad out of the grandparents' house, and despite Grandma's fierce fight not to leave that house, finally she accepted to go, on the condition that it was only while Grandpa got better. A little later, the truth about that night would come from my uncle's mouth when Grandma escaped to go to her old house. When my uncle gathered all his brothers, including my dad, to go look for her because they had a good idea where they were going to find her, they found Grandma dead in a room in the forbidden area. Supposedly, there were some candles arranged in a certain pattern. The cause of death was a massive cerebral hemorrhage, and Grandpa didn't take long to accompany her, as he died a week later. Grandma's house remained abandoned for a long time, and the brothers talked at length about what they would do with it. Finally, it was decided to demolish it and sell only the land. "I don't want to be responsible if whatever is in that house affects anyone else," said the eldest of my uncles, although I think most of them were only thinking about how much they would get from the sale of that place. I want to add that just before this house was demolished, a kind of completely hidden room was found. Until then, the door to it had been upholstered. Its contents, without delving too much into the topic, was not proper of a Catholic or sane person. Part 4. The Revelation. Several years passed with some tranquility. My father, after the grandparents' death, could never fend for himself again. When the grandparents died, my dad became a wreck, to the point that the uncle we had been living with had to take care of both Sophia and me. I was fed up with all the crap that surrounded my family. Raoul the crazy, my mother the witch, the damned things from Mazamitla, the black grandpa, the white grandmother, that collection of modified fingers in the grandparents' secret study. So I immersed myself in my studies to the degree that when I graduated as a general physician, she didn't even exist. Time passed and I successfully entered a specialization, and I took this opportunity to put even more distance between the family and me. Upon finishing the specialization, I went to live in Monterrey, and there I got married and had 3 children. I separated almost completely from my family, except for an occasional monthly call to my uncle. About Sophia, I stopped knowing when I left the specialization. I found out she had married a wealthy guy and had gone to live in Guanajuato. At Christmas 1996, I remember sitting with several of my uncles to talk, man to man. I wanted to know some things, and they knew exactly what that was that I was going to ask about. The people around here have stories and give them names, son. Believe me, what I have seen, I don't know what name to give it. You would do well to remember what happened to those kids in Mazamitla. You didn't get to know your great-grandmother, and you should thank God for that, because if that woman wasn't a witch, I swear to God, I don't know what a witch is then. In those days, the family business began to take off, but we had to live in the countryside on the great-grandmother's lands. Your mom, you can't believe it, she had no family. She was found in the forest by a friend of our family. The great-grandmother called her Diablo, or sometimes Daughter of the Forest, and said that by rescuing her, they had committed the worst of mistakes. Since then, there have been accidental deaths in the family, and certainly for me, all that was superstition. For me, the only witch that existed was the great-grandmother, and well, apparently my mom too. And finishing his story, my uncle just let out a tired laugh. Part 5. The Return. My account continues then in a contemporary era. In 2016, it was December again. It was raining as if the sky were going to fall. I remember having arrived from work extremely tired, and just entering the living room of the house, my wife approached me with a worried face. "Sophia is calling you." Upon hearing that, I felt like I was going to faint. I even had to hold onto a chair and then sit down slowly. Something bad had happened, I was sure. I hadn't spoken with her in years. For what other reason would she call me? I began to feel an intense fear, like when I heard Raul speak to me from under the bed. I had an anxiety attack and told my wife I wasn't interested in answering, that I wasn't interested in anything having to do with my family. I headed to the kitchen while loosening my tie, thinking how tranquil and happy my life had been until then, and that I wasn't going to allow some lunatic from my family to steal this from me, no matter if the lunatic was my sister. "You're her only family," said my wife, hugging me from behind. I noticed she was crying. That dissipated any doubt. Something terrible had happened. My wife gave me a paper where she had written down my sister's number, and I remember that when I sat down to dial it from my cell phone, it slipped from my hands several times. On the third ring, she answered. The only thing I could say was, "Sophia, it's me." "Brother, it all started again. It all started again," she told me. I don't want to go into details about what happened to my sister. However, I can tell you that her only son had just died from an illness very similar to Raul's. I was about to tell her I wasn't going to the wake because I was no longer Catholic, and she explained to me that they didn't even have a wake for the body, but that he was cremated immediately, and not a day had passed when her husband had already abandoned her. The disfigured faces of Raul and Mom came to my mind, and God forgive me, but I can't blame this man for having abandoned her. Perhaps seeing her so vulnerable, I told her to come with me at least for a while, and I bought her tickets to fly to Monterrey. All that night I had nightmares about Raul and Mom. I saw them mocking me. The next day I went to pick up Sophia at the airport, and upon seeing her, I was sincerely scared. She was extremely emaciated. She didn't even look like she was younger than me. I didn't want to say anything to her, but on the way back, I broke the silence by asking her what had happened. "It all started again, brother. What happened to Raul happened to my sister, and it's been happening to me for a while too." Upon hearing that, believe me, I felt like stopping the car and asking her to get out and not to call me ever again. But she was my sister. Besides, this time I was already a man, and a man of science. Initially, perhaps I felt that this time I could face it. We accommodated my sister in a small guest house, despite my wife's complaints, who said it was rude not to let her stay in the main house. However, I had 3 children, and I had to protect them. From the first day, I swear I heard the stifled laughs from before. It was as if I was 14 years old again when I got up to close the door. I even woke my wife up on several occasions, who told me I was too obsessed with the past. I think it was December 22nd or 23rd when suddenly I woke up in the early morning, and I remember having clearly seen a battered silhouette by the side of my bed. If you are naked, it seemed to have twisted arms and legs. Oh God, I remember if I said it or saw it. When I turned on the light, that figure simply vanished into thin air. And I remember my wife even woke up annoyed and scared. She asked me what was happening, but at that moment, my eldest daughter let out a scream from her room. I ran to her and entered quickly, expecting to find Sophia, and yet, upon turning on the light, only my daughter was there, trembling under the sheets. There was someone in the room, Dad, a figure that was dancing in a very strange way, and it had no head. At that, my wife entered, and as she crossed the door, we heard how footsteps ran down the stairs at full speed. Then we heard how the living room door opened and slammed. "Son of a bitch," I said, and instinctively went to look for my other two children who were still sleeping peacefully. I lifted them and took them to our room. There was my eldest daughter and my wife. "This is the last straw. I'm going to tell my sister to leave. There wasn't anything strange until she arrived," I said, very annoyed. And when I was about to leave the room, my wife stopped me. "Are you crazy? Obviously someone got into the house. I already called the police." And indeed, a few minutes later, the police arrived. We let them in, and they searched the entire house with me. There was nothing strange. The house was completely empty, just some muddy footprints in some areas of the house. We then went to check the guest house to see how my sister was. We found her convulsing, and the officers immediately called for an ambulance. After explaining to my wife what was happening, I told her I would feel much more comfortable if the kids went to her parents' house, and in the meantime, I would take my sister to the hospital. I admitted her in a private hospital in San Pedro, and she was already in bad condition, so I suggested she be transferred to intensive care immediately, where I could continue treating her. The days passed, and Sophia began to evolve favorably with the medications. For my part, I was more entertained ordering every analysis I could think of. However, no results came that gave me an explanation of what was occurring. They all seemed like a dead end. In my house, things calmed down a bit, though I must say that from time to time I became very anxious when alone in it. Finally, I requested a study called polysomnography, a study where brain waves are monitored during sleep. Upon reviewing the results, something didn't add up, but I didn't know what it was, so I showed the studies to a young doctor who was treating my sister at the hospital. "Are you kidding, right?" he responded with a mocking laugh upon carefully reviewing the results. "I know something isn't right, but specifically which result?" "Specifically?" he said again in an increasingly mocking tone. "Doctor, you're supposed to know this better than me," he added. I won't bore you with technical details, but the doctor explained to me that my sister, during the night, never presented brain activity characteristic of deep sleep. He also explained to me which parts of the brain are involved and that usually this is seen in hereditary and fatal mental illnesses. "Make sure they perform an autopsy on her when she dies," he told me. Die? Look, doctor, people with this brain activity during sleep do not have a long life expectancy. Essentially, her body sleeps, but her brain never does. And this causes progressive deterioration that can cause psychotic outbreaks until they die. Investigate fatal familial insomnia. I had heard of that illness, but never thought it was something important. And believe me, when I read about it, I was terrified, because many of the things exposed seemed related to what Raul had. When I returned home with my sister, my wife forced me to leave her in the main house. She was deteriorating quickly. Sometimes I found her talking to herself, other times immobile. Again, it was the same thing that had happened with Raul. That period of January 2017, we sent the children to stay with their grandparents. I didn't want them to live through the same thing I lived with my brother. I still hadn't spoken with my wife about the possibility that I too could be a carrier of a fatal and hereditary illness, unless when we already had 3 children who could also suffer from it. The mere idea of imagining my children in that situation gave me chills. However, those recent discoveries had made me convince myself that nothing that had happened to me throughout my life was actually something paranormal, though deep down, I still thought it. That night, I had to respond to an on-call in the early morning, and when I was on my way back, my wife called me on the cell phone. She was hysterical and was on her way to her parents' house. She had woken up in the early morning and saw with her own eyes that headless figure moving in a very strange way in her bedroom. I drove quickly to her. She told me that giggles had woken her up all over the room. It sounded as if there were many invisible people inside the bedroom. She tried to turn on the bedside lamp and it didn't turn on, and it was when her eyes had adapted to the darkness that she could see that strange figure moving in the room. And she says that the thing was stepping on her heels, but that when she got in the car, she didn't see it anymore. And Sophia, where is she? Your sister stayed in the house, she told me very sadly. But I couldn't blame my wife for not getting my sister out of there, especially when I had been blaming her for all these paranormal apparitions that were occurring around us. However, this was my sister. Damn it. And if there was something in the house with her, I had the obligation to get her out of there. I would have wished not to do it, but it was my duty. I returned to the house. The front gate was wide open. The house at the back was observed submerged in shadows. As I walked the stone path, I began to feel a terrible cold, and a strong wind began to be felt, and those laughs from when I was 14 years old were heard. Everything that was happening made me think again of that moment. The entrance door was also open. Sophia? Upon entering, and I felt as if the darkness at the back moved. That made me take a step back, and when my eyes got used to the darkness, I could see two of those headless figures with hunched backs, long arms, and legs in the living room. It was heard from the ceiling, and looking up, I could see Sophia with a stitched-up smile hanging from one of the chandeliers we had. I ran out of there, but before getting in the car, I called the police again. I had found the door open without an apparent explanation. They didn't take long to arrive, and upon explaining what happened, they proceeded to search the house again. And once more, we didn't find anything. My sister was in bed, sick and bedridden as always. Part 6. The End. Or at least for the moment. The end of my story, or at least for the moment, occurred in mid-2017. My sister was already very deteriorated. In fact, she rarely got out of bed anymore. We had hired a nurse to take care of her. In August, my children and their cousins had a serious car accident. So serious that 2 of my nephews died, and my eldest daughter was very badly injured and required emergency surgery. I took the phone, called my family in Guadalajara about the situation I was going through, and that I needed help also so they could be with Sophia. Several cousins told me they would take the first flight to Monterrey. The nurse who took care of my sister at night was absent that day, and I needed to go to the hospital to see how my daughter was doing. I had to call that young doctor who, throughout this time, perhaps reluctantly but with great skill, had been handling my sister's case. Upon explaining my situation to him, he made a long pause on the phone and finally responded, "All right, I'm on my way." I don't know exactly what happened. My cousins arrived at 7 in the morning, and I told them to go to my house to take care of Sophia. Thank God my daughter came out of the surgery well and would recover soon. My other 2 children only had minor injuries. Upon arriving home at night, I found my cousins on the street, scared. We went in running, and the house was a disaster. That young doctor was sitting next to my sister's bed, and she seemed to be sleeping. The doctor had scratches on his face and arms and also seemed to have bled from the nose. "Your family is a bunch of useless people," he said upon seeing me enter. He asked about my daughter while arranging his things to leave. The kid had nerves of steel to still be there while the whole family was terrified on the street. "By the way, I don't think your sister has much time left," he told me as we walked to the exit. "Oh, really?" What happened to me today easily enters the top 10 worst experiences of my life. Only in the top 10? He responded, "Everyone thinks their story is always the worst." Giving me a pat on the back, he added, "Look, doctor, I'm agnostic, and I know your sister is sick. However, I wouldn't get near her again without a priest or a rabbi or a monk or something. I can only tell you that today I saw some very interesting things." To this day, he has never told me what happened during that night. He has made clear he never will. I have made peace with that fact. My sister died days later. I still live and will live forever with the uncertainty that what took my brother, my mother, and my sister will take me, perhaps, or one of my children. Everyone thinks their experience has been the worst. Having told my story, I have often been asked to relate the Mazamitla experience in detail, and now I have. After 30 years, memories become opaque, but some things never fade. The sound of bones grinding as a broken body stands up to laugh at you, the sight of your mother chasing you backwards, the face of your brother telling you that her blood will consume us all. The people around here have stories and give them names. My great-grandmother called my mother Diabru, daughter of the forest, and said that by rescuing her they had committed the worst of mistakes. Since then, there have been accidental deaths in the family. My mother had no family. She was found in the forest. Perhaps that's the simplest explanation. Something came out of the forest with her, something that sleeps in the blood and wakes when the body should rest, something that makes you dance naked among the trees, that makes you crawl under beds like an insect, that makes you laugh with broken bones and a missing jaw, something that waits. I'm a doctor now. I know about fatal familial insomnia. I know about prions and genetic mutations and the cruel mechanics of hereditary disease. But I also know what I saw when I was 8 years old, what I saw in Mazamitla, what I saw in my own house in Madurai. I know that my sister hung from a chandelier while headless figures danced below her, and that when the police arrived, she was peacefully in her bed. Science gives me one explanation. My memory gives me another. I will live with both until the day I die, or until the night I stop sleeping and the blood demons finally come for me too. Thanks so much for staying with us all the way to the end of this video on Overseas Ghosts. It truly means a lot to us. As a new channel, we know there are still many things we can improve, and your feedback is incredibly valuable in helping us grow and do better with every story we tell. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Your support keeps the stories alive and motivates us to bring you even more chilling tales from around the world. We can't wait to see you again in the next story. Until then, stay curious and stay safe.